In November of 1985, a hunter walking through a quiet stretch of forest in Allenstown, New Hampshire, noticed something that didn't belong. Half buried near a stone wall, deep in the woods where almost no one ever walked, sat a rusted metal drum. It had clearly been there for years, weathered by seasons of snow and rain, half swallowed by leaves and undergrowth. Something about it made him stop. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect to find this far from any road, this deliberately hidden behind a wall that led nowhere. He pried it open, and what he found inside would sit unsolved, unnamed, and almost unexplainable for the next 40 years. He called the police immediately. What they found when they arrived was worse than anyone expected, and it was only the beginning. Because 15 years later, just 300 feet away in the same patch of forest, someone would find a second drum. And the truth, hidden inside those two containers, would turn out to be one of the strangest, most patient, most quietly devastating crimes in American history, one that wouldn't be fully solved until this year. Inside that first barrel, police found the remains of a woman and a young girl, wrapped together, hidden with obvious care and obvious intent. There was no identification, no missing person report that matched, no name to attach to either of them. Forensic examiners could tell they had been placed there years earlier, likely in the late 1970s or early 1980s. But beyond that, almost nothing. Investigators sent dental records to police departments across the country. They compared fingerprints against every database available at the time. They circulated composite sketches to newspapers, hoping a neighbor, a coworker, anyone might recognize the woman's face. No one in the area had reported them missing. No dental records matched. No fingerprints existed on file. It was as if this woman and this child had simply never been registered as living at all. No school records, no employment history, no family asking questions. Investigators searched for any lead for years and came up with nothing. The case went cold, filed away in New Hampshire as an unsolved mystery with no name and no direction. Just two evidence tags reading Jane Doe and Jane Doe. And it would stay that way until the year 2000, when a survey crew clearing brush in that same patch of woods stumbled onto something that changed everything. Just 300 feet from where the first barrel had sat for 15 years, workers found a second one, hidden so close that investigators were stunned no one had found it sooner. Inside were the remains of two more girls. 4 victims now, all female, all unidentified, all connected somehow to the same small patch of forest. Investigators quickly determined that all 4 had likely been killed by the same person at roughly the same period of time and placed in these barrels with the same careful, methodical concealment. But identifying them proved just as impossible the second time around. DNA testing in the early 2000s was nowhere near advanced enough to trace family lines from partial remains. Facial reconstruction sculptures were carefully built by forensic artists from the shape and structure of each skull, and photographs of the finished busts were released to the public in the hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize them. News segments ran across New England. Flyers went up in towns the victims had likely never even lived in. For years, nothing came of it. 4 people, a mother and 3 young girls it seemed, had been erased so completely that not one relative, neighbor, or friend ever came forward. The case became known informally among investigators as the Allenstown 4, a name that would follow it for the next 2 decades. Detectives who worked the case in those early years described a particular kind of frustration that never faded. Evidence without a story, victims without a history, a crime scene that gave up bodies but refused to give up context. Every few years, a new detective would be assigned to the file, dust it off, run the sketches past whatever new database existed, and file it away again when nothing came back. Whoever had done this hadn't just killed them. He had made sure that no one would ever come looking. The first real break didn't come from the victims at all. It came from a name, or rather, a collection of names that all turned out to belong to the same man. In 2002, An investigator working the Bear Brook case noticed striking similarities to an unrelated missing persons case out of California, where a man calling himself Bob Evans had once lived quietly with a woman and her young daughter, playing the role of a devoted partner and stepfather, before vanishing overnight and taking the woman and child with him, the two of them never seen again. Digging into Bob Evans revealed something unsettling. The name was fake. So was the one before it, and the one before that. Investigators eventually identified the man's real identity as Terry Peter Rasmussen, a man who had spent decades slipping between towns, jobs, and families under an ever-shifting list of aliases, each one backed by fabricated documents, just convincing enough to get him a driver's license, a job, a marriage certificate. He would appear in a new town, charm his way into a relationship, live quietly as a partner or stepfather for a year or two, and then disappear completely, along with, investigators would come to believe, whoever had been living with him. He was, by every account people gave of him, unremarkable, forgettable even. Neighbors described him as quiet and pleasant. That was exactly the point. The more investigators dug into Rasmussen's past, the more disturbing the pattern became. He had lived under at least a dozen known aliases across multiple states and decades: Bob Evans, Curtis Kimball, Gordon Jensen, and others, each one attached to a different town, a different job, a different family who had trusted him completely. In one identity, he worked as a mechanic. In another, he presented himself as a widower, raising a young daughter alone, a story that earned him instant sympathy from new communities. In some cases, he married. In others, he simply moved in and played the role of a devoted partner and father figure, sometimes for years at a time, blending seamlessly into small-town life before the pattern repeated itself. And then, without warning, he would vanish, sometimes taking a woman and her children with him, only for that woman and those children to never be seen again. Their absence explained away to neighbors with a simple story. They moved, they went back to family, they wanted a fresh start. Rasmussen was eventually caught, not for the Bear Brook murders, but for a separate crime in California in the early 2000s, where he was finally convicted and sent to prison under one of his aliases before his true identity was confirmed through fingerprint records tied to a decades-old arrest. He died behind bars in 2010, never charged for what happened in that New Hampshire forest, and, investigators believed, never fully honest about how many families he had erased over the decades. Investigators who later mapped his known movements found a man who had crossed the country multiple times, always settling in modest working-class towns, always choosing partners who were somewhat isolated from extended family, women whose absence, if it came to that, would raise fewer questions. For years, all anyone had was his shifting list of names. The victims in the barrels still had none of their own. The turning point came from a technique that didn't even exist when the second barrel was found: genetic genealogy, the same method used to finally identify the Golden State Killer just 1 year earlier. In 2017, genealogist Barbara Ray Venter and a team of researchers began working the case, extracting what usable DNA remained after decades in the ground and uploading the profiles to public genealogy databases, the same ones ordinary people use to find distant relatives. It was painstaking work, branch by branch, name by name, cross-referencing hundreds of distant cousins to slowly narrow down a family tree that led back to one household. By 2019, the effort paid off. 3 of the 4 victims finally had names: Marlise Honeychurch and her 2 daughters, Marie Vaughn and Sarah McWaters. They had last been seen alive in California in 1978, and it became clear that Rasmussen had once been involved with Marlise before she and her daughters simply disappeared from every record that mattered, last known to have been traveling with him. After more than 3 decades in the ground and in cold case files, 3 of the 4 had finally been given their names back, and for the first time, investigators could put faces, birthdays, and a real family history to the remains that had waited so long in an evidence locker. Somewhere, Distant relatives of Marlies Honeychurch, who had spent 40 years believing she and her daughters had simply drifted out of contact, learned, in the same phone call, both who she truly was and what had happened to her. But one victim remained a mystery, a young girl, believed to be the middle child among them, whose DNA didn't match the others as closely as expected, a detail that would take years and one final twist to explain. The turning point came from a technique that didn't even exist when the second barrel was found: genetic genealogy, the same method used to finally identify the Golden State Killer just 1 year earlier. In 2017, genealogist Barbara Ray Venter and a team of researchers began working the case, extracting what usable DNA remained after decades in the ground and uploading the profiles to public genealogy databases, the same ones ordinary people use to find distant relatives. It was painstaking work, branch by branch, name by name, cross-referencing hundreds of distant cousins to slowly narrow down a family tree that led back to one household. By 2019, the effort paid off. 3 of the 4 victims finally had names: Marlies Honeychurch and her 2 daughters, Marie Vaughn and Sarah McWaters. They had last been seen alive in California in 1978, and it became clear that Rasmussen had once been involved with Marlies before she and her daughters simply disappeared from every record that mattered, last known to have been traveling with him. After more than 3 decades in the ground and in cold case files, 3 of the 4 had finally been given their names back, and for the first time, investigators could put faces, birthdays, and a real family history to the remains that had waited so long in an evidence locker. Somewhere, distant relatives of Marlies Honeychurch, who had spent 40 years believing she and her daughters had simply drifted out of contact, learned, in the same phone call, both who she truly was and what had happened to her. But one victim remained a mystery, a young girl, believed to be the middle child among them, whose DNA didn't match the others as closely as expected, a detail that would take years and one final twist to explain. All 4 victims of Bear Brook now have their names back, a milestone investigators call one of the most important moments in the history of forensic genealogy, and a case that helped prove the technique could work even after decades of decay. But naming the dead was never the same thing as understanding the man who killed them. Terry Rasmussen died in prison in 2010, and with him died any confession, any full accounting of how many lives he actually erased across 4 decades of stolen names. Pepper Reed, Ria's mother, is still officially missing. Her case remains open, and investigators believe she is very likely another of his victims. Her remains never found, her final resting place unknown. Some investigators suspect the true number of people Rasmussen killed may never be fully known. Buried under aliases in towns that never connected the dots, families quietly assumed to have simply moved away. The barrels are empty now. The forest looks the same as it always did, a quiet stretch of trees a short walk from a state park where families still hike every weekend. But somewhere in Rasmussen's 40 years of vanishing acts, there may be other families who simply stopped existing, and no one, to this day, has gone looking for them. This has been The Dark Stories. Sleep well.